The morning sun barely touched the windows of Kensington Palace when Catherine woke with a heavy heart. The news had arrived just hours before dawn, through a phone call that would change everything. William sat on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on both of them like a thick blanket of sorrow. Catherine reached out and placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his body carried the burden of a nation's grief alongside his own personal loss. They had known this day would come eventually, but knowing something and living through it were entirely different experiences. The palace corridors that usually buzzed with activity felt eerily quiet, as if the very walls understood the gravity of what had happened. Staff members moved through the halls with hushed voices and careful steps. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for direction, waiting for someone to tell them what came next. But William and Catherine knew that the responsibility fell squarely on their shoulders. They were not just grieving family members. They were public figures who would need to guide a nation through its darkest hour. The first official meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. Palace advisors, government officials, and members of the royal household would gather to discuss arrangements, protocols, and the delicate balance between private mourning and public duty. Catherine looked at the clock and realized they had less than 2 hours to prepare themselves mentally and emotionally for what would be one of the most challenging periods of their lives. She moved to the window and gazed out at the grounds where photographers were already beginning to gather. Soon, the world would be watching their every move, analyzing their expressions, measuring their grief against some invisible standard. The thought made her stomach turn. How do you mourn properly when millions of eyes are upon you? How do you show strength while also being authentic about your pain? William joined her at the window, and together they watched as more media vehicles arrived. The circus was beginning, and they were about to become the main act in a show they never wanted to perform. He took her hand in his, and she felt the slight tremor that ran through his fingers. Even the future king was human, vulnerable to the same fears and uncertainties that touched everyone in moments like these. The phone rang again, startling them both. More condolences, more arrangements to be made, more decisions that couldn't wait. Catherine watched as William straightened his shoulders and answered with the composed voice he had been trained to use since childhood. But she could see the cost of that composure in the lines around his eyes and the way he gripped the phone just a little too tightly. Their children would need to be told soon. The thought of explaining this loss to young minds who still believed the world was mostly safe and predictable broke Catherine's heart in new ways. How do you help children understand something that adults struggle to accept? How do you protect their innocence while preparing them for the reality that would soon surround them? As the morning light grew stronger, so did the sounds from outside. Crowds were beginning to gather, people bringing flowers and cards, some crying openly, others standing in stunned silence. The nation was looking to the palace for guidance, for some sign of how they should process their collective grief. William and Catherine knew that their response would set the tone for how the entire country moved through this difficult time. The weight of expectation was enormous. They needed to be strong enough to lead, but vulnerable enough to be relatable. They needed to honor tradition while also being genuine about their emotions. It was a delicate balance that would require every ounce of their strength and wisdom. As they prepared to face the day ahead, both knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The conference room at Buckingham Palace filled with somber faces as advisors, officials, and family members gathered for the most important meeting of their lives. William sat at the head of the long mahogany table, with Catherine beside him, both dressed in black despite the early hour. The formal planning process was about to begin, and every decision they made would echo through history. Sir Edward, the palace's most senior advisor, spread documents across the table with practiced efficiency. There were protocols to follow, traditions dating back centuries, but also modern considerations that previous generations never had to face. Social media would broadcast every moment globally within seconds. International leaders were already calling to express condolences and discuss attendance. The world had changed since the last time such arrangements were necessary. Catherine listened as the men discussed logistics, security arrangements, and ceremonial details. She found herself thinking about the personal touches that would matter most to those who were grieving. While protocol was important, she knew that people needed to feel connected to the ceremony, to feel that their emotions were acknowledged and honored. She made mental notes about flowers, music, and small gestures that could make a massive event feel more intimate. The conversation turned to the children and their role in upcoming events. William's jaw tightened as he considered how much to include them, how much exposure was appropriate. They were so young, yet they were also part of the royal family, expected to participate in public mourning in ways that other children would never experience. Catherine reached under the table and squeezed his hand, a silent reminder that they would navigate this together. Hours passed as they worked through endless lists and considerations. Food for visiting dignitaries, transportation routes, media positions, security sweeps, guest accommodations. Each detail seemed small on its own, but together they formed the framework for an event that would be watched by billions and remembered for generations. The pressure was overwhelming, but they pressed on because there was simply no alternative. During a brief break, Catherine stepped onto a palace balcony and was surprised by what she saw below. Thousands of people had already gathered, creating an ocean of flowers, cards, and photographs. Children held handmade signs, elderly people sat in folding chairs they had brought from home, and teenagers took selfies while wiping away tears. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. A small girl, perhaps 6 years old, caught Catherine's attention. She was standing near the palace gates with what appeared to be her grandmother, holding a single yellow flower. The child kept looking up at the palace windows as if hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family, to make some kind of connection during this confusing time. Catherine felt tears well up in her eyes as she realized how many children across the nation were probably feeling scared and uncertain. When the meeting resumed, Catherine found her voice in a way she hadn't before. She spoke about the people gathering outside, about the need to acknowledge their grief and make them feel seen. She suggested moments of silence, opportunities for public participation, and ways to honor the personal relationships that had meant so much to so many people. Her colleagues listened with new attention, recognizing the wisdom in her perspective. William watched his wife with admiration as she advocated for the human elements of the ceremony. She had always been the one to think about feelings first, to consider how events would affect ordinary people trying to process extraordinary circumstances. Her insights were changing the conversation, making the formal protocols feel more meaningful and accessible. As evening approached, they realized they had been planning for nearly 10 hours straight. The initial framework was in place, but there would be many more meetings, many more decisions, and countless details to finalize. They were both exhausted, emotionally drained from confronting the reality of what lay ahead while also trying to honor the magnitude of what had been lost. Walking back to their private quarters, they passed windows that showed the continuing vigil outside. People were lighting candles now, creating a warm glow that pushed back against the darkness. Some were singing softly, others praying, many simply standing in quiet solidarity. The sight reminded them both why their work mattered, and gave them strength to continue when everything felt impossible. 3 days had passed since the news broke, and Catherine stood in front of her bedroom mirror adjusting the black dress she would wear for the first public appearance. Her hands shook slightly as she fastened her pearls, the same ones that had been worn by generations of royal women during their most solemn moments. Today, she and William would step outside the palace gates to greet the crowds that had been maintaining a constant vigil. The children had taken the news better than expected, though Catherine could see the confusion in their eyes when they asked questions she struggled to answer. They understood that someone very important had died, but the full weight of what that meant for their family and their country was still beyond their young comprehension. She was grateful for their innocence, even as she worried about how to protect it in the days to come. William appeared in the doorway dressed in his formal black suit. His face showed the strain of the past few days, but there was also a determination in his posture that hadn't been there before. They had spent hours the night before discussing what they would say to the crowds, how they would balance their personal grief with their public responsibilities. Every word would be scrutinized, every expression analyzed for meaning. Their private secretary briefed them one final time as they walked through the palace corridors. The crowds had grown even larger overnight, with people traveling from across the country to pay their respects. There were families with young children, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers who had skipped school, and workers who had taken time off to be part of this moment. All of them were looking for some sign of hope, some indication that their nation would emerge from this tragedy stronger than before. The palace doors opened, and Catherine felt a wave of sound and emotion wash over her. Thousands of voices calling out, cameras clicking, and underneath it all the sound of people crying. She took a deep breath and stepped forward with William, their hands briefly touching for comfort, before they separated to greet different sections of the crowd. A middle-aged woman pressed a handmade card into Catherine's hands, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about what this loss meant to her family. Catherine listened intently, nodding and offering quiet words of comfort, aware that this conversation was being witnessed by millions, but trying to focus only on the genuine pain of the person in front of her. These individual moments of connection felt more important than any grand gesture or formal speech. An elderly man in a military uniform stood straighter when William approached, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He began to share a story from decades ago, a brief encounter that had meant the world to him. William listened with the patience and respect that had been instilled in him since childhood, understanding that sometimes people just needed to be heard, needed to feel that their memories mattered. Children pushed toward the front of the crowd, their faces serious with an importance they didn't fully understand. Catherine knelt down to speak with them at eye level, accepting their drawings and flowers with genuine gratitude. She could see their parents watching anxiously, proud that their children were participating in history, but also worried about exposing them to such heavy emotions. The planned 15-minute walkabout stretched to nearly an hour, as both William and Catherine found themselves drawn deeper into conversations with mourners. A teenage girl broke down sobbing as she handed over a letter she had written, prompting Catherine to step closer and offer a brief hug despite protocol. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, but Catherine didn't care about the optics. Sometimes human decency mattered more than royal procedure. As they slowly made their way back toward the palace, both realized how much they had needed this direct contact with the people they served. The past few days of meetings and planning had been necessary but isolating. Being among citizens who were experiencing the same grief, the same uncertainty about the future, reminded them that they were all navigating this loss together. A young father holding a toddler called out to William, his voice breaking as he tried to express what this moment meant to his family. The child, unaware of the solemnity of the occasion, waved enthusiastically at the prince, bringing the first genuine smile to William's face in days. It was a reminder that life continued even in the midst of profound loss, that there was still joy to be found and hope to be nurtured. Back inside the palace, they sat quietly in their private sitting room, processing what they had experienced. The weight of responsibility felt different now, more personal but also more manageable. They had seen the faces of the people they were serving, had heard their stories and shared their tears. The formal ceremonies and protocols that lay ahead would be meaningful because they had been grounded in these authentic moments of human connection. The morning of the ceremony dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself was mourning. Catherine woke before sunrise, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Today would be the most challenging day of her life as a member of the royal family, requiring her to be strong for millions of people, while dealing with her own overwhelming emotions. She moved quietly through their bedroom, not wanting to wake William, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of restless tossing. In the bathroom mirror, she practiced the expression she would need to maintain throughout the long day ahead. Not too sad, which might seem weak, but not too composed, which might appear cold. The balance was delicate and unnatural, requiring her to perform grief rather than simply experience it. She applied her makeup carefully, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized by cameras and commentators around the world. William was awake when she returned to the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring at his formal ceremonial uniform hanging on the wardrobe door. The military decorations and gold braiding that usually symbolized honor and tradition now felt like the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. He looked up at Catherine with eyes that revealed the depth of his anxiety about the day ahead. They dressed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the next few hours would bring. The palace staff moved with quiet efficiency, making final preparations while trying to remain invisible. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation, the historical significance of what was about to unfold. This was the kind of day that would be remembered and studied for generations to come. Their children appeared in the doorway, dressed in their own formal black clothes, looking far too serious for their young ages. Catherine knelt down to adjust their collars and smooth their hair, fighting back tears as she realized how this day would mark a turning point in their innocence. They would never again live in a world where such profound loss felt impossible or distant. The car journey through London was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. Streets that usually bustled with traffic were lined with silent crowds, thousands upon thousands of people standing in respectful attention. Some threw flowers as the procession passed. Others simply bowed their heads or wiped away tears. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath, united in a moment of collective grief that transcended all other divisions. At Westminster Abbey, world leaders and dignitaries waited alongside ordinary citizens who had won lottery tickets for seats. The sight of presidents and prime ministers sitting next to teachers and nurses, all equal in their mourning, was both humbling and inspiring. Catherine realized that tragedy had a way of stripping away artificial barriers and reminding everyone of their shared humanity. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of music, readings, and rituals that had been refined over centuries. Catherine, focused on breathing steadily, on maintaining her composure while allowing herself to feel the full weight of the occasion. Beside her, William stood with military precision, but she could see the slight tremor in his hands and knew that he was fighting the same battle between duty and emotion. When the time came for William to deliver his tribute, Catherine watched with her heart in her throat. His voice was steady but thick with emotion as he spoke about loss, legacy, and the responsibility they all shared to honor what had been entrusted to them. The words were formal and carefully chosen, but underneath the protocol, Catherine could hear the pain of a man trying to make sense of an impossible situation. The procession following the ceremony was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire day. Walking slowly through streets lined with millions of mourners, Catherine felt the weight of their expectations, their need for reassurance, their desperate hope that somehow their leaders would help them navigate this dark period. Children held up signs, veterans saluted, and families clutched each other as the formal cortege passed by. A moment that would haunt Catherine forever came when they passed a group of schoolchildren who had been brought to witness history. One little girl, perhaps 7 years old, began crying so hard that her teacher knelt down to comfort her. Catherine wanted desperately to break protocol, to go to the child and offer comfort. But she knew that maintaining the dignity of the ceremony was more important than her personal instincts. As they finally returned to the palace, Catherine realized that they had successfully completed the most public and formal part of their mourning. But she also understood that this was just the beginning of a much longer process of healing, both for their family and for the nation. The cameras would eventually turn away, but the work of moving forward would continue long after the world's attention had shifted to other stories. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Catherine stood in the palace garden watching their children play, grateful for the sound of laughter that had been absent for too long. The immediate media attention had finally begun to fade, but the emotional aftermath continued to ripple through their lives in unexpected ways. She had learned that grief was not a single event, but an ongoing process that would reshape them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. William had thrown himself into royal duties with an intensity that worried her. Every day brought meetings with government officials, visits to organizations affected by the loss, and ceremonies that required his presence. She understood his need to stay busy, to feel useful during a time when so much felt beyond anyone's control, but she also saw how the constant performance of strength was wearing him down. The letters continued to arrive by the thousands. People from around the world sharing their own stories of loss, expressing gratitude for how William and Catherine had conducted themselves during the darkest days, and offering support that felt both touching and overwhelming. Catherine had taken to reading a few each morning, finding comfort in the shared human experience of surviving difficult times. One letter particularly moved her, written by a woman who had lost her husband the same week as the national tragedy. She wrote about watching the ceremony on television and feeling less alone in her grief, seeing that even royals struggled with the same emotions she was experiencing. The woman thanked Catherine for showing that it was possible to be strong and vulnerable at the same time, to honor duty while also honoring authentic feelings. The children had begun asking different questions now, deeper ones that revealed how they were processing what had happened. Their oldest wanted to know why bad things happened to good people, why sometimes life felt unfair, and what their family's responsibilities meant for their own future. Catherine found herself having conversations she had never expected to have so soon, trying to provide comfort while also preparing them for the realities of their unique position. A breakthrough moment came during a private visit to a children's hospital, something they did quietly without media attention. Catherine watched William interact with young patients who were facing their own serious challenges, and she saw how his genuine care for others was helping him process his own grief. He wasn't just performing royal duties, he was rediscovering his sense of purpose through service to others. One little boy in the hospital, barely 5 years old and recovering from major surgery, asked William if he was sad about what had happened to his family. The directness of the question caught William off guard, but instead of deflecting, he knelt down and answered honestly. He said yes, he was very sad, but that talking to brave children like him helped him feel better. The boy nodded solemnly and offered William one of his toy cars to keep, saying it always made him feel better when he was scared. That evening, William placed the small toy car on his desk, where it remained as a reminder of the unexpected wisdom that can come from those who have faced their own difficulties. Catherine realized that their public grief had created opportunities for these kinds of authentic connections, moments when the barriers between royals and citizens dissolved completely. The palace staff had also been affected by the events, and Catherine made an effort to check on their well-being. Many had worked for the royal family for decades, and this loss was deeply personal for them too. She organized informal gatherings where staff could share their own memories and feelings, creating space for healing that went beyond the formal protocols they had all been trained to follow. As autumn arrived, Catherine noticed subtle changes in how she and William approached their responsibilities. They were more intentional about the causes they supported, more aware of how their presence could provide comfort to others who were struggling. The experience of public mourning had taught them that their role was not just ceremonial, but genuinely therapeutic for many people who looked to them for stability and hope. Their marriage had also deepened through the shared experience of navigating such intense public scrutiny while dealing with private emotions. They had learned to support each other in new ways, to communicate more directly about their needs and fears, and to protect their family's emotional well-being while still fulfilling their public duties. The crisis had tested every aspect of their relationship and somehow made it stronger. 6 months had passed since that terrible morning when everything changed, and Catherine found herself standing once again at the palace windows, but this time watching a different kind of gathering. Below in the courtyard, families were arriving for a celebration of life event that she and William had organized to mark the healing journey their nation had taken together. The contrast with those dark early days was striking, yet the memory of that grief remained woven into who they had all become. The event was William's idea, born from countless conversations with citizens who had approached them during public engagements. People wanted a way to acknowledge that while the loss remained profound, life was gradually returning to a new kind of normal. Children were laughing again, communities were supporting each other in innovative ways, and hope was slowly replacing the overwhelming sadness that had defined those first difficult weeks. Catherine watched as their own children helped greet the arriving families, their natural warmth and energy, bringing smiles to faces that had carried too much sorrow for too long. The experience had aged them in some ways, making them more aware of life's fragility and their family's unique responsibilities, but it had also taught them the power of compassion and the importance of being present for others during difficult times. The palace gardens had been transformed into a place of gentle celebration. Instead of the formal black decorations of the funeral ceremony, there were flowers in every color, representing the diversity of ways people had found to move forward. Local school choirs were performing songs of hope, community groups had set up displays showing how they had supported each other, and artists had created installations that honored both the loss and the resilience that had emerged from it. William gave a brief speech that Catherine knew had been written and rewritten many times as he struggled to find the right tone. He spoke about the journey they had all taken together, how shared grief had revealed the strength of human connection, and how the darkest moments had somehow illuminated the very best qualities in people throughout the nation. His voice was steady now, confident in a way that had been hard-won through months of uncertainty. One of the most moving moments came when a group of children who had lost parents in the same time frame were invited to plant a commemorative tree. Catherine watched as these young survivors, some barely old enough to understand what they had experienced, carefully placed soil around the roots while adults wiped away tears. The symbolism was powerful but not forced, representing growth that would continue long after the ceremonies ended. An elderly woman approached Catherine during the informal reception that followed, introducing herself as the grandmother of the little girl they had seen at the gates during those first difficult days. She explained that her granddaughter had been deeply affected by seeing Catherine's tears during the public appearances, understanding for the first time that even grown-ups and important people felt scared and sad sometimes. The woman said this realization had actually helped the child process her own fears about an uncertain world. Catherine realized in that moment how their decision to show authentic emotion, despite the risks and criticism it might have brought, had been the right choice. People needed to see that their leaders were human, that strength came not from the absence of feeling, but from the courage to feel deeply while continuing to fulfill responsibilities to others. The performance of perfect composure would have been less helpful than the demonstration of genuine resilience. As the afternoon drew to a close, Catherine and William walked through the gardens together, stopping to speak with families, listening to stories of recovery and community building, and witnessing the remarkable ways people had found meaning in the midst of loss. They had learned that their role during crisis was not to provide easy answers or false comfort, but to create space for authentic healing, and to model how public figures could be both strong and vulnerable. The sun was setting as the last families departed, leaving the palace grounds quiet once again. Catherine stood with William and their children, all of them changed by the experience they had shared with their nation. They had discovered that leadership during tragedy required a delicate balance of personal authenticity and public responsibility, that showing emotion was not weakness but a form of service, and that healing happened not through forgetting, but through finding ways to carry loss that allowed life to continue. Looking back on those dark days, Catherine understood that they had all learned something essential about what it meant to be human in a world where suffering was inevitable but not insurmountable. The tears they had shed publicly had been honest, the strength they had shown had been real, and the connection they had forged with people throughout the nation had created a foundation for facing whatever challenges might come in the future. They had mourned as a nation, and in doing so, they had discovered new depths of compassion, resilience, and hope that would serve them well in the years ahead.